From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden says democracy is on the ballot next week in a speech in which he says that MAGA Republicans are imperiling democracy in America. We'll break down the speech and the thinking behind it. Plus, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates again by 75 basis points, and financial markets do not take it well. What are they worried about? Welcome, I'm Paul Gigot with Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel, all of us here from the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Let's first turn to President Biden's surprising speech, surprising in its timing, 6 days before an election Wednesday evening, in which his topic was democracy. Let's listen.
Instead of waiting until an election is over, they're starting well before it. They're starting now. They've emboldened violence and intimidation of voters and election officials. It's estimated that there are more than 300 election deniers on the ballot all across America. You know, American democracy is under attack because the defeated former president of the United States refuses to accept the results of the 2020 election. He refuses to accept the will of the people. He refuses to accept the fact that he lost. He has abused his power and put the loyalty to himself before loyalty to the Constitution. And he's made a big lie an article of faith in the MAGA Republican Party, the minority of that party.
Well, Kim and Joe, there's much in there that the conceptual level I certainly agree with. The rejection of violence to achieve political ends, certainly well worth saying always. Acceptance of fair election results, central to democratic comity and comity, and the ability to live in relative peace in a democracy, crucial. But, Kim, he's already given one speech on this theme on September 1st in Philadelphia, which was widely criticized at the time. I think that's where he introduced the term semi-fascists. He's dropped that. But the question is, why have a speech like this 6 days before an election when obviously he seems to be suggesting that when he says democracy is on the ballot, he didn't say this directly, but he seems to be suggesting, well, then you have to vote for Democrats to believe in democracy. Am I being unfair in that inference?
Not at all. I mean, this was a presidential address on primetime TV, and in the good old days, presidents used those messages to address the entire nation. This instead very much looked like a closing campaign message. He pegged it off of the horrible attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And all of his references were either outright or alluding to Republicans with regards to those who are election deniers, those who are supposedly engaged in voter suppression or voter intimidation. You heard him mention the 300 election deniers on the ballot. He's clearly referring to Republicans. This was a message aimed at, in my mind, Democratic voters, the Democratic base, in an attempt to get them out, get their minds off of the things that have been so central to voters in this election: inflation, the economy, crime, lockdowns, and instead suggest to them that if they don't get out and vote, that democracy hangs in the balance. As you said, we've heard him say it before. What flummoxes me is it doesn't seem to be working. As you mentioned, they did do this. It hasn't changed the discussion. And I'm a little curious as who's been giving him political advice.
Well, do you think this was then, therefore, just a base motivation tool where 6 days out, Democrats are, have been losing ground in the polls? If you tell the voters that the end is near, unless you come out, maybe more will come out?
If you're an independent or a conservative voter and you were watching that speech, there's no way from a common sense perspective, you can't sit there and say, wait, didn't you miss a few things here? When you say election deniers, are you talking about Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Hillary Clinton, who still doesn't accept the results of the 2016 election? When you talk about hyped up rhetoric, are you mentioning your own claims that Georgia's election reform was somehow Jim Crow? There's a lot to be said about overheated rhetoric on both sides and the need for everyone to accept some some of those principles you laid out in the beginning about accepting elections, toning down the rhetoric and rejecting violence. But he wasn't addressing all sides of this. He was addressing one side.
On your point about Georgia and what he said about Jim Crow 2.0, remember at the same time when he talked about that more than a year ago, he also said that if the rules were changed in Georgia, as he was criticizing them for trying to do, then that would mean that the elections this year were not legitimate, right? He actually said that. Now, we're finding out, of course, and as you've written, Kim, in your column, that in fact, turnout seems to be just fine. In fact, Democrats are turning out very well here in the pre-election day voting. So it doesn't look like that as at all a fair interpretation, but it's that rhetoric that he won't address on his own side. Now, people will say, oh, well, this is both sides and Paul. Trump is a unique threat and so on and so forth. I grant that Donald Trump's behavior on January 6th was awful, and Donald Trump has refused to accept the election. And I think that's corrosive of our democracy. I think that's very damaging over time, especially the way he's done it, because he had every avenue explored, that legitimate avenue to discover whether or not the election was stolen. And none of it panned out in court. But if you're trying as President of the United States to make the larger case of the country that we all have to accept election results, you can challenge them in court. You can have recounts and so on. But once the result is determined, then you have to accept them. And you have to avoid political violence. It seems to me that you have to speak as a larger figure than as a partisan 6 days before the election, Joe.
Exactly. And that's why I think you and Kim are almost being too generous to Biden here, because I think that this kind of speech is very dangerous on at least two dimensions. I mean, one is the reality is that we're coming into an election where it increasingly looks like it's going to be a Republican wave, and Biden is priming Democratic voters, his base supporters, to believe that that outcome is going to be illegitimate because it's going to represent a deep threat to democracy. So I think that that element of this speech was very dangerous. And I think that the other, perhaps subtler point here is that, I mean, for an electoral democracy like America's to work over the longer term, parties that do lose elections have to engage in a certain amount of introspection about why the voters didn't want to pick them. And that process already is kind of broken down a little bit on the Republican side over the past couple of years, precisely because it has not been healthy for the Republican Party to be so consumed with this stolen election myth President Trump was trying to propagate, because that disrupts this normal process of the party figuring out what it has to do to regain legitimacy in the eyes of voters. And now we're kind of getting hints that the Democratic Party is not going to engage in that kind of introspection if they get thumped the way the polls increasingly suggest they might next week.
How much at risk, Kim, do you think that we are that the results, if there are close races, look, there always are close races, right? And control of the Senate may hang in the balance, in particular this year in a state like Pennsylvania or Arizona or some others. And we may have to, the count in Pennsylvania, for example, is almost sure to go beyond Election Day if the election is close, because they don't start counting absentee ballots in the state until Election Day itself. So the early results are not of the same day voting is not determinative of the ultimate outcome. And that created all kinds of problems in 2020 that Donald Trump exploited, because he said, see, we were leading in the evening, and then suddenly the vote turned. Well, the vote turned because they were still counting absentee ballots cast before the election. But it allowed Trump to be able to say, implausibly in my view, but plausibly to some, see, they were just counting the votes in a way that I would inevitably lose. Whatever they needed to count, they counted to win. How much of a danger is there that something like that is going to happen this time?
I'm very concerned about it because, unfortunately, states like Pennsylvania, we saw that scenario play out in 2020 and had the last 2 years to potentially go back and fix some of this election language or the statutes in a way that sped up the system or dealt with some sort of overhaul of their vote counting system. That hasn't really happened. It's notable in that speech last night that the president said, everyone's going to have patience as the votes are all counted. Yeah, I get that. But in my mind, it would be much healthier for democracy if people weren't sitting there for days waiting to find out what the results are and allowing this kind of suspicion to foment the entire time that is happening. Now, add to that, in Pennsylvania, we just had the Supreme Court say, okay, we're not going to count ballots that haven't been correctly filled out or signed. However, we can't make a decision about what we're ultimately going to do with them. For now, we're telling people to set them aside. Okay, so do we end up in a situation where it's several days after the Pennsylvania Senate election and the two Senate candidates are within a couple hundred votes, and suddenly now the court's going to make a decision about whether or not to open those and count them? I mean, these are the kind of things that why you need to have very specific election rules and try to also get this done as close to the day of voting as you can.